Hi everyone, welcome to our live stream. Thanks very much for being here. I'm Peter. I've got Mrs. Cathy Williams with me, and
Hello, hello.
Cathy, in an earlier career, used to work in the Treasury and was directly involved in a number of roles with drafting budgets.
Well, I don't know
Um,
quite about drafting budgets, but I certainly spent the first part of my working career in the Treasury and had a number of roles that meant I was involved in one way or another with the budget, and I was fortunate a couple of times to actually have a seat in the House of Commons and watch the budget being delivered, which was really exciting. But I think today's been a pretty exciting day, hasn't it, Peter?
it certainly has that, yeah. It's Cathy's experience really is going to lead me to turn over the question and answer sessions mainly to Cathy. So we're going to encourage you to ask questions. You should have a question and answer box that you can use to type those questions into. I'm hoping it's visible on screen for you. If not, you might need to go into the little waffle, the 9 dots in the bottom right hand corner. We're encouraging you to like the questions asked by others as well. So if you see a question you think that's a really good question, give it a thumbs up, because that will help to guide Cathy and myself in terms of which questions we answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're going to do questions halfway through. Is that right, Peter? Halfway through and then at the end.
That's right. Yeah. So we're going to have about 20 minutes or so on the context, the background for this budget, question and answer session at that point. And then we're going to go into the policies which were announced today. We'll conclude that section round about 7 o'clock. That's the aim. And then Cathy and myself will stay online for another half hour for those who wish to stay on for further questions and answers at the end. Okay, well, let's get into looking then at the context of today's budget. It was a difficult context to say the least. You will have seen a lot in the news, I'm sure, about the dilemmas that have been facing Rachel Reeves as she put the budget together. And really, for me, the context, the background for this budget is one of dealing with the UK's growth problem. I'm sorry, I've got a very sensitive mouse button that occasionally clicks through to the next slide, so I'll come back. We've got a problem with growth in the UK. There's no doubt about it. Looking at the graph that's on screen just now, if you look at what's happened since the financial crisis in 2008. There we go. If we had carried on growing at the trend we were prior to the financial crisis, we would now have GDP which would be around about kind of 30% higher than it actually is. So something has happened to our trend growth since 2008. Just think if we had grown at the pre-global financial crisis trend, what that would have done for living standards, and indeed what it would have done for tax revenues as well, if we'd been able to sustain that growth. So the context for the budget is one really of the UK having a growth problem, and Rachel Reeves having to put together the budget against that background, and to try to find ways within the budget of not killing any growth that we have got, and if possible, growing the economy further. Okay, so just a few key terms we're going to be using, which you may very likely be familiar with, but just to check in with these. So a budget deficit is when government spending is greater than taxation revenue, so that the government has to borrow to bridge the gap. Budget surplus, when taxation revenue is greater than government spending, so that the government can use that surplus then to start paying down the debt a little bit. And the national debt is the accumulated sum of past budget deficits and surpluses. And a really useful thing for all of us to know, and for A-level students in particular, I think, is that the UK national debt is very approximately 100% of GDP at this point in time. Just slightly shy of that, but heading towards a point where to repay the national debt, the government would have to seize all of the output produced in the economy for a given year. So, lots of concerns about the size of that debt, and wishes perhaps for the government's budget position to move towards a surplus over time, which could be used to help pay down that debt a little bit. After all, at the moment, £1 in every 10 of government spending goes simply on paying interest on that debt. Not getting the debt down, just servicing the debt, paying the interest outstanding on it. Okay, I find this diagram amazingly useful for A-level students. It's not necessarily a requirement of a specification, but I have seen a number of A-level questions which would lend themselves very nicely to this graph. So if we start off assuming GDP was zero, if GDP was zero, then in theory, government spending would be very high at that point, because, with GDP zero, no incomes, then according to the policy framework of benefits as they stand, there would be a lot of benefit entitlement. And of course, even at zero GDP, the government would still have to do things like maintain the armed forces, the justice system, and so on. Okay. Now, the idea then is that as GDP grows, government spending quite automatically comes down, because as GDP grows, there'll be fewer benefit payments to make. So government spending will come down as the economy grows. You've got that negative correlation going on there. With taxation revenue, well, if there's no GDP, there'd be no taxation revenue. There's nothing to tax. But as GDP grows, then government taxation receipts will automatically grow. Okay, so this graph shows what happens to government spending and taxation quite automatically within the current policy framework as GDP grows. Okay, now the logical implication of that is that there is some level of GDP, I've labeled it Y star here, some level of GDP which would achieve a budget balance. Okay, and if we've got a budget deficit, as we have at the moment, that must mean that the current level of GDP is somewhere shy of Y star, so a Y1, as I've labelled it on the screen, for example. Okay, and so to move towards budget balance, it would be great to see GDP growing, but if that can't happen, and we want to achieve a budget balance, then policy changes have got to be made. We call these discretionary policy. If the government actively decides to change a policy, that's discretionary policy. So we might see, for example, in fact, we did see today, tax increases announced. Okay, and in theory, if you could move the tax line to T2, as I've done on the graph there, then you could achieve budget balance at the current level of GDP, Y1. Okay, just a bit of an issue with that though. As you put taxes up, do you create disincentives in the economy? If you tax people for working more, for example, do you disincentivize them from working? or if you tax company profits, do you disincentivize entrepreneurship? And the danger then is that you put taxes up and GDP could actually fall as a consequence of those tax increases. It's what's been described in the press quite a lot recently as a fiscal doom loop. But you feel you need to put taxes up to balance the budget, but what you might actually end up doing is killing economic growth. And if GDP were to fall, that could then lead you with lower tax revenue again and feeling you need to put up taxes again, and round you go in a spiral. Okay, so I think that really helps to see why Rachel Reeves felt she needed to put up taxes today. She wanted to move towards a balanced budget. And unless that was going to happen through economic growth, and we're struggling for growth, then it needed discretionary choices, either to put up taxes or to cut government spending. In the event, she's put up taxes, and she is going to use some of that actually to finance an increase in government spending. But more of that a little bit later on. Okay, as A-level students, I think we need to be aware of the nature of budget deficits. So on the right here, we have a cyclical budget deficit. Now, a cyclical budget deficit is one which is only there at certain points of a business cycle, typically during a recession phase of a business cycle, or at least a slowdown in economic growth. Because when GDP is falling, then that will lead to higher government spending on benefits and lower taxation receipts. It might be quite normal for the budget to be in deficit at that point. But if it's a cyclical deficit, what will happen is that as the economy recovers, during that recovery, taxation receipts will pick up. There'll be fewer benefit payments to make, government spending will come down. You might move to a surplus during the recovery stage. And over the length of a business cycle, what can be happening here is that the budget is broadly balanced over the length of a business cycle. There's a deficit during the recession, there's a surplus during a recovery, but they balance each other out, which would then mean that the national debt doesn't grow over time. Of more of a concern is a structural budget deficit like we have on the left. This is a deficit which is there at all stages of a business cycle. It's a deficit which grows during a recession and shrinks during recovery, but it's always there. And that means that the national debt is going to keep on growing. And to get a picture of the UK's budget deficit, just note on this graph that the last time we had a surplus was way back in 2000 to 2001. We have had 25 years of continuous budget deficits. In other words, indicating that our budget deficit has been structural in nature, therefore more of a concern to us, and associated with growing national debt over time. Okay. We might make exceptions, to the idea that a structural deficit is a cause for concern. So if the government was running a deficit for the purpose of investment, for putting funds into infrastructure and capital goods, we might see that a little bit more favorably, because we know that the capacity of the economy here, represented by production possibility frontier, is a function of the quantity and quality of land, labour, capital and enterprise available. And so if the government were using a budget deficit to finance public sector investment, that would help to grow the capacity of the economy. It would help us to achieve higher GDP over time. And of course, the bonus of that, I call it a fiscal dividend. If we grow GDP over time, taxation revenue will increase quite naturally because there's more stuff to tax as GDP increases. Okay, so we're kind of, okayish with long-term budget deficits, perhaps, if they're being used to finance investment. And you'd be looking in the budget today, perhaps both for increases in public sector investment, but perhaps also measures to incentivize private sector investment as well, because that would be brilliant to help grow the economy. And that would help to give us higher living standards, but also to bring in higher taxation revenue in the long term. Okay, so what we've just spoken about is informative in the context of what are called the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves imposed on herself a year ago and is adhering to. She wants the current budget balance to be, or current budget to be in balance or in surplus. Okay, and when we use the word current there, we mean relating to day-to-day spending. Okay, to have the current budget balance in surplus, or have a current budget at least in balance, would mean that the only borrowing taking place was for investment purposes, and we're kind of okay with that. We think. Okay, she also wants, of course, the national debt to fall over time, and using the measure of national debt expressed as a percentage of GDP. So that's the background. Going into the budget today, and she needs to make sure that she was moving the current budget towards balance, so that in a few years' time, the only borrowing will be for investment purposes. And she needed to get the economy on a path where national debt is going to be falling as a percentage of GDP in a few years' time. Okay. Last couple of bits of context before we have a quick Q&A. Let's remember that actually the tax burden in the UK at the moment is pretty high. So this is simply tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. And if you're going to raise taxes, the chances are that you're raising the tax burden. And we'd worry a little bit about the disincentive effects that might have. And much beloved of A-level economists and evaluation in this area is the Laffer curve, okay, which kind of draws on the idea of disincentives. So the idea here is that if the taxation rate is zero, well, there ain't going to be no tax revenue at a taxation rate of zero. But in theory, there'll be no taxation revenue at a tax rate of 100% either, because the disincentives would be so strong. Who's going to do anything if it's going to be taxed at 100% by the government? So there'd be no tax revenue there either. And the implication of that is somewhere in between, there is a taxation revenue, taxation rate, which is kind of peak point for revenue. It's likely to be different for every tax. But what we need to keep in mind here is that there is just that possibility that a tax increase could provide such strong disincentive effects that tax revenue could actually fall. If we were already at the peak tax rate or beyond it on the Laffer curve. Okay.
Peter, you're going to be really cross with me, Peter, for interrupting at this point.
Not a problem at all.
I'm just looking at the questions coming in on the chat, and there is one specifically about the Laffer curve, and
Okay.
I thought it might actually be quite a good place to address it. So this question essentially says, do we fear the Laffer curve too much?
Oh, do you want to go at that?
Well, I mean, my view is always that when you're setting policy on tax, there are enough examples of where governments have got badly bitten by this. I think especially where they've been putting up top rates of tax only to find that actually their tax take fell. And I think it's something that you should be very mindful of, certainly.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that going into today's budget, that the tax changes that were discussed and floated around in the press before budget day, and the expert discussion of those. There wasn't much in the expert discussion to suggest that anyone saw anything that would be actually bringing tax revenue down. So yeah, I would agree that it's something that we should always be mindful of. But I think on balance, the kind of tax changes that we've been looking at today would almost certainly increase revenue.
I think there's been a lot of talk when you are forced, as the Chancellor's obviously felt she has been, when you're forced into some sort of weird and wonderful tax changes. It's been called a smorgasbord, hasn't it? This budget. Yeah. That actually the risk of getting unintended consequences is perhaps higher than it might be if you're going for some of your main taxes. And again, I think that's something it's important to keep in mind.
That's a really good point.
I'll let you get back to your slides.
We were literally about to go into a question and answer session.
I just got excited about the questions. That was the trouble.
No, that's great. I was going to do a little advert, just let everyone know that I do a little bit of group tuition for those who are interested. Find out about it at the Economics Factory website. But we were going into the question and answer session, so we've made a start on that, and we'll take perhaps kind of one or two more questions, and then we'll look at the policies that are announced today.
Okay, so just some absolutely fascinating questions coming in. I'm just going to, if I can find it. There was just one sort of nitty-gritty bread and butter question, almost, if you like, Peter. Talking about your chart that showed the crossover lines of government spending and tax. Is that something that people need to know? Do they need to learn that diagram?
Okay. It is not a requirement. It is not a requirement, but I would recommend it to you wholeheartedly. There was certainly on AQA a few years ago, there was a 9-marker question that said, explain with the aid of a diagram how economic growth would improve the government's fiscal position. And I know that a lot of candidates answered that with an ASAD diagram, which was essentially showing the economic growth. And then candidates did analysis around that to explain how the economic growth would then improve the government's financial position. However, I think that possibly the diagram we've got on screen at the moment would have trumped that ASAD as a response to that question. And even though it's not directly there on the specification as you must learn this diagram, it's one that I would always teach when I'm teaching macroeconomics, and that I would love most students to know about.
Yeah, I think it's a great diagram. Actually, I've just with some of my students just been doing automatic stabilizers. And one of the things they can sometimes think is that these things kick in massively all of a sudden. And I think what this diagram highlights really nicely is that actually almost always there's some automatic stabilizer effect going on. It's just that sometimes it's quite small, as you can see on this diagram. But as your sort of output gaps get much bigger, whether they're positive or they're negative, these automatic stabilizer effects become much stronger. And I think this diagram shows it really nicely.
Yeah.
Just going back to the questions coming in, we've got another one. Why did the Chancellor choose to release a significant portion of her budget changes in advance, as opposed to other chancellors in previous years? I find this absolutely fascinating. When I worked in the Treasury, our budget documents are classified as top secret. In fact, perhaps I'm not even meant to say that, but they were. Nothing was released at all. So we're talking quite a few years ago, and it's been a really sort of increasing trend, to the extent. I was writing for something for my students today, and I thought, well, you know, we've had so much coverage of this, I'm just going to guess at what I've got to write. And almost everything about this budget had been released ahead of time. So we never know for certain, but I think certainly there's been an element of perhaps the Chancellor trying out ideas. So, for instance, was she going to increase income tax, which would have broken the their election promises, and that seemed to go down very badly, and that isn't something she's done. Was there a view that the financial markets might be more accepting of this budget if it had been broken to them a little bit at a time? I certainly think there's an element of that. I think this is a really interesting question that we don't necessarily have a clear answer to, but I think it's something as economists it's interesting to watch. Linked to that, oh, I've just seen, Peter, I might hand this to you. What's the UK's worst tax?
The UK's worst tax?
Yes.
Okay, now that is... Where shall we go with this one? What tax do we most dislike?
Dislike. Well, which one? Well, we've got as economists, and we should always think as economists, shouldn't we? We've got our rules as to, or our little, they're called the canons of taxation. Adam Smith's ideas around that. So, which ones
gives
do
you a
we
framework?
think? Yeah.
I'm not a great fan of stamp duty.
No.
I think so. Stamp duty, essentially a tax on the purchase of a house, and I think that distorts the housing market very, very significantly. The way stamp duty is structured, I think, is not entirely helpful. So when a house goes up in value such that it becomes subject to stamp duty, stamp duty is charged on the entirety.
Yeah, it's a very weird tax, isn't it? It's a very
so
weird tax.
you go from paying nothing in stamp duty to paying quite a lot. And that leads to clustering in prices in the housing market. So you get a lot of houses on the market are just below the threshold at which stamp duty kicks in. So I think that heavily distorts the housing market. And I'm not a great fan fan of it.
Maybe we should return to this question when we've talked about what's actually been done in the budget today, and we can perhaps add to things that we think
That's
might
a
be
good
a
idea.
worth tax. Shall
I,
we?
I can see possibility of a post-meeting discussion on social media as well, where people can suggest the worst taxes
Yes.
and make a case for it.
I'm mindful of time, but I think there's a sort of group of questions that have come in. I'm just really picking up on growth. So I think that was where you started off. There's quite poor growth outlook for the UK, even though the OBR forecast for the short run has been urged up.
Yeah.
Further out, it's worse than that. So we've got a sort of couple of questions around this. Whether the poor growth record is a problem of the government's making. Somebody else saying, thinking about your first chart, I think, where you talked about the change in trend. Would this have been better if the government at the time, so coming out of the global financial crisis, if they'd actually borrowed and spent more at that point, rather
Great
than
question.
adopting their austerity policies?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a problem of the government's own making. I'm not. I wouldn't want to attribute it to this government's making. I know there's a lot of political debate about Rachel Reeves sort of seeking to blame the issue on what has gone before, on Brexit, for example, on COVID, and so on. The truth is that the UK has had a long-standing productivity problem, and that since 2008, our productivity has been lagging behind. Productivity growth has been lagging behind other G7 nations. So it's not a problem that began with the election of a new government in 2024. You could make the argument that we're only 18 months into that new government, and that it would be a little bit early yet for an incoming government to have been able to achieve anything significantly to turn productivity and growth around. All that said, there are not really very many green shoots, signs of hope around at the moment, which you might be expecting to see, if the incoming government has had a really sort of positive impact. Would things have been better with a bit more borrowing back in 2008 and 2009 coming out of the crisis? We went into a period of austerity pretty soon after that, and my feeling is yes, they would be better. But if that borrowing had been used in ways which had fostered skills and developed human capital, that we might be in a significantly better position than we are at the moment. That's my feeling on that.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I admit to being a Keynesian through and through, I have to say. I do think it was very difficult for governments back after the financial crisis. Again, if you think about your chart that showed the national debt as a percent of GDP increasing really quite dramatically, and yes, there we go. So you can see it. Isn't it good? I'm pointing it at my screen. I realise people can't see that, but you can see that very dramatic increase there, and a real concern that you had to buy yourself some room for manoeuvre. So if you were faced with a similar economic shock, again, yeah, there we go. Thank you, Peter. Then you've got to have some fiscal wiggle room to deal with it. I too think growth might have been a little bit better. Personally, I'm surprised that the policy of austerity didn't have a worse impact on growth. And just finally, because again, I know this isn't all about the questions and answers, but just trying to piece together some of the questions that have been coming in. And one of the earlier ones I picked out about why were so many details of this budget released ahead of time. There's actually been quite a lot of people talking in the press saying actually they think that this has been really damaging to UK growth prospects now. So all this uncertainty around this budget and talk about what may or may not be in there has had quite a negative impact on business confidence in a way that is going to damaging going forward.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed that little Q&A session. We should get on to the policies that are announced in the budget today. And in terms of the big picture, we've seen government spending increases announced, and we'll perhaps have a look at one or two of those. But we've seen a slightly larger increase in taxation. Okay, so it's what we'd call a small net fiscal tightening. Because taxation is a leakage from the circular flow, this is going to reduce the level of activity, so essentially lower aggregate demand. But we also need to be mindful of the effects of today's policy on the supply side, policy announcements on the supply side of the macro economy. And we'll have a look at some microeconomic impacts, of course, as well, because although the budget is primarily, I guess, a macroeconomic event, the macroeconomy consists of individual markets, all aggregated together. And several of the policy announcements were in relation to particular markets, could be seen as helping to correct market failures, perhaps, and will also have microeconomic impacts in terms of affecting the distribution of income. So, big picture is a small net fiscal tightening as a result of today's budget. Interestingly, it's a loosening over the next couple of years. So the increases in spending are coming through before most of the increases in taxation revenue. Okay. Tax increases will be 0.7 billion next year, and then there's another 26 billion coming through of tax increases in 2029 to 30. So further increases to the tax burden have been deferred. One figure I went straight to the Office for Budget Responsibilities report to find today, because I think it's incredibly useful for A-level students, is the OBR's estimate of the output gap, which they said today remains very similar to in their last report at minus 0.5% of our productive capacity. So we've got a small amount of spare capacity in the economy, and that stat is so useful to you for A-level answers. You might have macroeconomic mocks coming up, for example, where you're evaluating changes to monetary and fiscal policy that are going to affect, say, the level of AD in the economy. And the level of the output gap is so relevant to evaluating the effects of that. So lodge that figure in your mind. According to the OBR today, our output gap is minus 0.5% of capacity. Okay, we're getting into the nitty-gritty. I've divided this into three sections. And we're going to start off with measures relating to income and wealth and distribution. Okay, so Widely expected was that Rachel Reeves today would freeze the income tax bands for a longer period of time, which is done. She's extended the existing freeze by three years. And to explain how that would help the fiscal position, imagine if you had someone with an income of 12,570. Okay, now that's the tax-free allowance. If you had that income, you would pay no tax at all. Okay. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume we now have 10% inflation, and that everyone's income goes up by 10% as well, to compensate them for that. So someone whose income was 12,570 would get an extra £1,257. It would exactly offset that increase in the general price level. It would leave them the same with the same real income. Okay, but of course, with the tax band frozen, that extra £1,257 isn't actually going to be at a zero tax rate. That will be now in the basic rate tax band and being taxed at 20%. So that person who was paying no income tax, the wage has gone up by 10%. It's compensated them for 10% inflation. They've got the same real wage they had before, but now they're paying some of that in tax. So they'll have a lower real disposable income, and it's swelling the government's tax revenues. Okay, and similar will apply to people who are just below the threshold of 50,270, where you move from paying 20% tax to 40% tax. It will apply to anyone who's near one of these thresholds if their income goes up to compensate them for inflation. This is a phenomenon called fiscal drag. People getting dragged into higher tax brackets by inflation. And it's something which over the last year or two has actually helped to increase government tax revenues. And by freezing the thresholds for a few more years, Rachel Reeves is counting on that bringing in significantly more tax revenue, but all sorts of questions that you might have around whether that's the right thing to do. But it's what has been done. Yesterday, we learned that the minimum wage is to be increased next April. There's been a lot of talk over the last year about the minimum wage because we had a very big increase in April 25, at the same time that employers had to pay higher national insurance contributions as well. And there's this concern that this makes it more expensive to employ people. Okay, it is the traditional argument against minimum wages, but they might cause real wage unemployment. They might make it too expensive to employ people and become a source of job losses. Now, historically, since the minimum wage was introduced in 1999, there's been very little, if any, evidence of the minimum wage being a source of unemployment. But the concern over the past few months is we might have reached a tipping point with that. We might have reached a tipping point. Lots of concern being expressed by businesses, and of course that concern will only be heightened by the increase that was announced yesterday. Potentially great, of course, for those who are going to receive the increase in the minimum wage. It could help to lift some out of poverty, but you've just got that concern about whether a tipping point might have been reached or not. Okay. UK wealth is much less equally distributed than income. Okay, so we use Gini coefficients to measure the degree of inequality on a scale of 0, which is complete equality, up to 1, which is total inequality. And the UK's income Gini is 33%. Our wealth Gini is 64%, almost double that. So wealth is much less equally distributed than income. And a lot of people have been making the moral argument that it's better to tax people who are wealthy than to tax people for working. Okay, in other words, we should, according to this viewpoint, be using more wealth taxes and doing less by the way of taxing income. After all, if we tax people's income, we might disincentivize them from working. Okay, so there's a kind of normative aspect to this, where it's seen as being perhaps equitable or fair to tax wealth and to use it to some degree to support the less fortunate in society, so to redistribute. But there's always been concerns around wealth taxes. So Rachel Reeves today announced that there'll be what's popularly known as a mansion tax. It will affect those who are living in houses worth over £2 million. They will have to pay each year additional council tax of £2,500. Those with houses worth over 5 million will have to pay 7,500. Okay. Now, the sort of concern you get around this is people say, oh, what about people who are asset rich, have a very valuable house, but don't have a lot of income coming in? So, for example, perhaps a pensioner who worked hard through their working life to save and to buy a house which has gone up in value over time, might be worth now over 2 million, and therefore subject to the tax. But that pensioner might not actually have a whole lot of income coming in. So yeah, there might be some concerns there. There are also broader arguments people make about taxing wealth that suggest that it's really very difficult to tax wealth, because the wealthy are very good at moving their assets around. You know, can move assets to countries where wealth isn't taxed, for example. So probably the mansion tax is at the lower end of the scale of wealth taxes in terms of whether it would cause concern or not, because this isn't a tax on kind of financial assets that could easily be shifted abroad. Yeah, you might find one or two sort of very productive individuals within our economy who might say, oh, okay, I want to go and live elsewhere instead of in the UK. But perhaps the disincentive concerns aren't too great with this particular tax. One thing to note is that, go on, Cathy.
I was just going to say there, you were talking earlier about the trouble that stamp duty causes in the housing market. And some questions are coming in on this actually about how is this actually going to be valued? I've seen other stories in the press about are there things that people can actually do to try and reduce the value of their houses? I think this one's going to cause a bit of bother.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of detail, I guess, which perhaps isn't fully known to us yet in terms of the mechanics of how it's going to work. It's kind of a first sort of brave step, isn't it, into the world of wealth taxes? Yeah, there's been so much call for it from those who are uncomfortable about the very unequal distribution of wealth, and a lot of appetite for it, I think, amongst Labour MPs who see it as a fairer way of raising tax revenue than other possibilities available. I'm interested by the fact that it's only claimed that it's going to raise 0.444 billion as well. And I always like to have a way of putting these kind of numbers into context. So roughly, according to OBR estimates, if you raise the basic rate of income tax by a penny in the pound, that would raise 7 billion. So yeah, just put it in context. This is actually quite a small number.
Yes.
Yeah, but the wealth tax is going to raise at the moment.
I mean, certainly early reports, these sort of leaked reports on this did talk about measures for wealthy homeowners who are actually income poor, which as you say is quite common. But I have to say I've not seen any detail around how that might actually work, but I think that would be really interesting.
Interesting to look out for.
But I think one thing that it's really important for students to realise is that the UK, in terms of its wealth inequality, it is extraordinarily high for a developed country. And as I understand it, London is particularly unequal. I mean, if you think about it just in terms of houses, if you think about some of the very poor areas of London, and actually some of the places where houses are worth absolute fortunes, so many times these 2 millions and 5 millions that are being talked about in the mansion tax.
Yeah, great stuff. So pension tax relief, quite a controversial one this. Government's announced today that they're going to have to be national insurance contributions paid on what's called salary sacrifice, which is essentially where someone gives up part of their salary to put it into their pension. And gets tax relief through doing that. Essentially, this is going to make pension saving a little bit less attractive than it was previously for some who use the salary sacrifice scheme. It will raise money, of course it will. But I guess there's a little sort of concern there because, on the whole, we want to encourage people to save for their pensions rather than discourage them. Big headline: the scrapping of the two-child benefit cap. I think we all knew it was coming. So until now, you'd only been able to get so the universal and tax credits for your first 2 children. That cap has been scrapped today. Or at least it's scrapped from April. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time with the issue of child poverty, because I think it's something which is quite a likely source of A-level questions. So the hope is that scrapping the cap is going to lift 400,000 children out of poverty. The UK, as we can see from this graph, has seen increases in child poverty, and quite significant increases in child poverty over recent years. Yeah, so this is something which is naturally of concern. And we worry about poverty cycles. So poverty can be seen as a market failure, both from a normative point of view, kind of issues of fairness and equity, but also in terms of positive economics. What we can hypothesize and test, which is that poverty serves to damage the future capacity of the economy and limits economic growth. So this is the poverty cycle. Adults in poverty bring up children in poverty. And that may affect educational opportunity for those children, which limits the amount of human capital that they accumulate during their education years. When those children become adults and enter the labour market, they have reduced earnings potential as a result of that lower human capital. And then they may become adults in poverty themselves, raise their own children in poverty, and the cycle is set up. So, for us as economists, finding a way of breaking that poverty cycle is pretty vital. And there's an argument that the two-child benefit cap has been contributing to that poverty cycle, and that removing the cap will help to overcome it, with then potential benefits in terms of the future growth of the economy. So, we're not trying to be political today, but I will admit that I am quite pleased to see that that policy announced.
Do you mind, Peter, if I chip in very, very briefly on this? If you can just go back to that amazing chart that showed how badly the UK was doing. And really, it's just astonishingly badly. If you look at that, twice as badly as the next one that's doing really quite badly. And one of the very few differences between the UK and some of these other countries was our two-child benefit cap. So I really, really think it's something that had to be done, especially as there's increasing evidence in the case of the UK that not only do we have these numbers of children living in poverty, but they're actually falling deeper and deeper into poverty. So it's not just that you get this sort of vicious cycle of self-perpetuating poverty, but it becomes much and much more likely. But I think will prove quite controversial. Certainly some of the people I've been talking to today that's a terrible policy. And I think real concerns, not my concern, and evidently not yours, Peter, but concerns that for some families with more children, now they would receive more on benefit than they would do doing a minimum wage job. But we know that an awful lot of these families living in poverty do have at least somebody that works in that household. So this was an expensive one, wasn't it? About £3 billion, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
This, but I completely agree that this was the right thing to do.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cathy. So the pension triple lock wasn't a feature really of today's budget, but I feel we need to mention it in passing. That the government is committed to maintaining the pension triple lock, which essentially ensures that state pensions go up by the greatest of either rate of inflation, average earnings growth, or 2.55%. The state pension will go up next April by 4.8%, which is because average earnings growth is the highest of these three at 4.88%. That's been used to set the state pension increase for next April. But it's just while we're talking about issues of distribution and questions of normative economics and fairness, there are quite a few observers who feel that the pension triple lock may be a source of unfairness in that it might be protecting the incomes of pensioners to a degree that other sections of society including younger people, are perhaps not receiving the same sorts of protection. So I thought that we should give it a mention while we're doing this section on income, wealth, and distributional issues. Okay, great. The government has also introduced a number of tax increases today that could be seen as correcting for negative externalities. In other words, helping to cure market failures. And it's important to remember that, that fiscal policy isn't just about macroeconomics. Fiscal policy changes not just the level of economic activity, but the pattern of economic activity. So it can be used to encourage some things, like consumption of merit goods. It can be used to discourage others, like consumption of demerit goods. Okay, so on screen we've got a classic demerit good diagram. A good such as online gambling, where we might argue that there are negative third-party effects. So those addicted to online gambling, for example, might impose costs on third parties in society, such as families, friends, the health service, and so on. And those third parties have no way of using the market to gain compensation for that effect. So you end up with overconsumption of demerit goods such as online gambling at Q1 compared with the social optimum of Q star. Okay. Now, of course, one of the classic ways of correcting for these negative externalities is to impose tax. And today it was announced that the online gambling tax is going to be increased from 21% to 40%. So a significant hike in that tax, with the aim, yes, of raising revenue, of course, but you can argue that this is, that there's a strong case for this because it is helping perhaps to correct a market failure as well, and therefore actually to achieve a more efficient allocation of resources within the economy. Along similar lines, for the last few years, we've had a sugar tax on sugar content of fizzy drinks. That has today been extended to include milky drinks, which were previously exempt. So we can expect to see prices of milkshakes and lattes going up, unless the producers of those things actually lower the sugar content of the drinks to avoid the tax. And actually that happened quite significantly with the tax on fizzy drinks a few years ago. We can see this again, both as a way of raising revenue, but also correcting a market failure. It's always good to have context evidence when we're trying to evaluate something. We kind of look back to, have we got anything we can use as a guide? And, looking back at what happened with the first sugar tax on fizzy drinks a few years ago, there were significant changes to recipes to reduce sugar content, helping to achieve the policy objective. There's also evidence that demand was not as inelastic as people might have expected. So that the World Health Organization, for example, its study of sugar taxes around the world says that a price increase for fizzy drinks of 20% reduced consumption by 20%. So unitary elasticity, suggesting a kind of reasonable effectiveness of higher prices in reducing consumption. Okay, English mayors have been given new powers to levy tourist taxes. And again, we can see this as being related to negative externalities, because you can make arguments that tourism imposes negative externalities on the communities where the tourism takes place. And again, have we got any evidence on how tourist taxes work? Well, yes, we have. They're in use in a number of places around the world. Paris, New York, Milan, for example. And the evidence to date suggests that kind of fairly moderate tourist taxes seem to have very little impact at all in terms of dissuading tourism. But yes, they might create a little bit of revenue, which can be used for offsetting the negative externalities that tourism brings. I guess some local communities might choose to invest the revenue in actually making themselves more attractive for tourists, because it's an injection into the local communities, a circular flow of income. But that was an interesting announcement. This one is really eye-catching. It's counterintuitive, perhaps, because the government's been trying to encourage people towards electric cars. But today they've announced that there's going to be a new tax per mile driven in electric vehicles, 3p per mile, 1.5p for hybrid cars. Yes, it kind of goes against that objective of encouraging us to drive electric cars. What we need to remember, however, and the argument that the government will make, is that drivers of electric cars will still contribute to things like sort of damage to road surfaces, but drivers of electric cars will still contribute to congestion on the road. And that there might be a fairness argument, but they should at least contribute. It's also perhaps something which is born out of necessity, because the switch to electric cars threatens to deprive the government of an awful lot of taxation revenue. The government gets a lot of revenue from taxing petrol and taxing diesel. And if we're all going to be driving electric cars, the government needs to replace that revenue. And so this is a first step, whatever you make of it. It is a first step towards deriving taxation revenue from electric vehicle drivers.
Peter,
Okay.
just very quickly, if I may, I spotted some really interesting numbers from the Department for Transport that EVs, because generally they have lower running costs, actually tend to be used more than petrol and diesel cars. So these cars are on the roads more.
Yes. Yes.
And I also spotted some interesting numbers that if you look at fuel duty, which is in essence, it's a tax on miles travelled. It's obviously going to vary a little bit depending on fuel efficiency, but that works out as 5p per mile on average for petrol and diesel cars. So I thought that was an interesting number to contrast with this 3p per mile.
It's a good number to have, isn't it? Brilliant, thank you. So last section here is a very, very short section. We're hoping for measures today in the budget, perhaps, which would incentivize growth in some way. We said this is, it was the difficult context for the whole budget, for lack of growth. We need growth, both for our living standards and to generate higher taxation revenue. Was there anything that Rachel Reeves could do to boost growth? Bearing in mind that she needed to achieve a higher taxation revenue. There are a few bits and pieces in there. Extension of free training for under 25s in small and medium-sized enterprises, businesses. Changes to the rules for ISAs, individual savings accounts, where you could previously save £20,000 tax-free in a cash ISA. And the change that has been made is that has been dropped to 12k, but you can still have another £8,000 tax-free. If your ISA is invested in other ways, such as stocks and shares, so that should make it a little bit easier for companies to raise money for investment purposes. And it was already announced, but it sits in the sort of package of policies announced today that is to be a guarantee of paid work for any young person who's been unemployed for 18 months or more. Okay, so these measures should help to boost growth a bit, but it's worth keeping in mind that the headlines of today's budget, the headlines haven't really been about measures to boost growth. The headlines have been about measures to increase taxation revenue. Yes, to pay for a little bit of additional spending in important areas such as poverty alleviation and scrapping the two-child benefit cap. But to conclude, before coming back to the fiscal doom loop, there are more tax increases now in the pipeline, largely coming through in 2029-30, so 4 years or so away. And what are going to be the effects of those tax increases? Will our economy be able to grow in that context? By and large, I think we have to accept that tax increases are likely to detract from the rate of growth. But will we have enough else going on? Will we have enough other sources of growth to keep us on a good path and avoid the dreaded fiscal doom loop? So I am going to wrap up there, and Cathy and myself have faithfully promised to stay online until 7:30.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. I just think there's a couple of questions that came in a little bit earlier on. So if you ask questions later on, we will get to those. But Peter just said something that I think was really interesting. He said something like, given that she needed more tax revenue, and I've written down here, but did she? Did she really need more tax revenue? So we've had some questions coming in saying, first of all, who do governments borrow from? And another really interesting question here, what percentage of national debt as a share of GDP is sustainable in the long run? So I think all of these things really tie together. And one of the things that I've really noticed in the press coverage of this budget is that whenever people talk about the fiscal rules, they always preface them with the self-imposed fiscal rules.
That's true. Yeah.
And I very much feel that what's happened here, governments, all sorts of governments have fiscal rules. They just usually ignore them. But this government hasn't done that. So they started off by saying these fiscal rules really, really matter. And it really, really matters that we hit them. And then perhaps not surprisingly, when they started to miss them, there was bother. So why does all of this matter? Coming back to, well, who do governments borrow from? So in the case of the UK, they borrow from a lot of different people. So some of them are banks and so on, and other financial institutions here in the UK. Quite a lot of them will be overseas. And really what's happened is that people have started to get nervous about the amount that this government is borrowing. And in part, they've got nervous because the Chancellor has, in essence, told them they should be nervous. So there's this target that they're trying to hit that they are missing. And so what that's meant, and why we have £1 in 10 going on debt interest, is because the government is having to pay more interest on the borrowing it's doing, because people are becoming more nervous. So if we come to this question, what percentage of national debt as a share of GDP is sustainable in the long run? And we look at Japan, for instance.
Yes.
So Japan has a national debt to GDP ratio of 250%.
237, I think.
It is massive
Yeah.
compared with the UK. Absolutely massive. But they borrow in different ways. They borrow domestically much more, and they don't appear to be in this kind of cycle of worry that we've now sort of got ourselves into. It does what
Their bond yields are much lower as well. The rate at
they
which they can
are.
borrow.
But
Yeah.
the UK's always used to be much lower. And before we
Yeah.
came on air, Peter and I were talking about what's happened to bond yields. So we don't have a chart of that, but it's been really interesting today. So if you get a chance, do Google that, and what you'll see is sort of as the budget was kind of leaked, really, as it was today, the OBR documents, you see the 10-year bond yield really plummet, which actually indicates that people were feeling more confident. Then, as they sort of digested very quickly this OBR document that had been released unexpectedly, you see them spike right back up again, and then generally over the course of the afternoon come back down to a lower level. So it really does look as though the market has been a little bit reassured by what has happened today.
Yeah. I'll be a very relieved Chancellor, I think.
What do you want me to do, Peter? Go back to the beginning and work my way through this?
Just any interesting questions for the chat? It'd be great to get stuck into some of them.
One question that's come in that I think is quite interesting, really is what would we have done differently? You know, we've got people on the chat going, actually, I'm going to try and be Prime Minister now. Obviously thinking they could have done better. What would we have done differently? Peter, what do you think you might have done differently to this Chancellor?
Okay, I was interested in the discussion ahead of the budget about having what was called a 2 up, 2 down policy. So Rachel Reeves for quite a while was signaling that she would actually increase income tax rates, and that didn't actually happen. Here we go. I've got a slide about this. So the essential idea was that she was going to raise the raise income tax by 2p, and move national insurance contributions down by 2p. So that might sound like it's neutral, because national insurance is charged against income. So in some senses, it's another form of income tax. So you put one up by 2p, you put the other one down by 2p. You might think that would be neutral. Okay, but what it would actually have done is to raise a little bit more tax revenue from pensioners, because pensioners who are not working, they're not paying national insurance contributions. But pensioners who have significant incomes, whatever source those incomes might come from, would then pay income tax, about 2p extra on the income tax rate, and therefore it would, while appearing neutral on the surface of it, it would have raised some more tax revenue, and it would have done so from pensioners. Now, it's always going to be politically controversial to do anything which might be to the financial detriment of pensioners. It's always going to be politically controversial, but there is a potential case for that. There's that argument we made reference to earlier on, but perhaps pensioners are being protected in a way which isn't necessarily true of other age groups in society. I've long felt that the government has tied its hands too tightly by saying that we won't put up income tax. Governments ever since Tony Blair have come into power promising that they won't put up income tax rates. And I think sometimes it's necessary to do that to pay for other things. So I'm not sat here saying that I would have favoured an increase in income tax for its own sake, but as one of the possible means of raising revenue, which could be used for measures to stimulate growth and to improve the life chances of younger people. I would have supported that.
Yes, I think it was such a shame, and actually my heart sank in the election campaign when this phrase was first mentioned: we're not going to raise taxes on working people, because as every economics student knows, when you look at where the bulk of tax revenue actually comes from, it comes from that. It comes from your income tax. It comes from your VAT, which and also you've got the problem of what do we mean by working people as well. I like to think that actually I might have avoided getting quite so deeply into this situation we're in at the moment, but if I hadn't, I too, I'm very sure that I would have gone with increasing the rate of income tax. It would have been very unpopular, but I think it's better to be clear what you are doing. So these freezing of income tax bans, they're called a stealth tax for a reason, that a lot of people don't quite understand what's happening. But this is going to have really, really big impacts. It's going to bring lots of pensioners into paying tax for the first time. Because of the way it's paid, people are going to have to fill in tax returns, which they've probably never, ever had to do in their lives before. And I just think it would have been so much better to do that. One of the things, just looking through the questions that are coming in, which Peter are absolutely excellent. Lots of people picking up these sort of smorgasbord of taxes as I described them, and said, but surely the problem with that is this, and surely what's going to happen is this. And yes, people are absolutely right that there may well be all sorts of unintended consequences. So if you're someone on the chat saying, well, surely with the milkshake tax, as it's being called, then sugar is just going to be replaced with artificial sweeteners, and aren't those even more problematic for health? And that's one of the big problems with all of this, and one of the issues.
There is a potential unintended consequence there, but just going back to that idea of, what hook can we use to try and get a feel for what will actually happen? I guess that the same could have happened with fizzy drinks. 6-7 years ago, and
Yes.
actually that's a policy now which is pretty unanimously sort of endorsed, I
Yes.
think. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Yes. Oh, somebody right towards the end of the question, could you argue that this budget is more politically motivated than economic?
That's really good, isn't it?
It's a really
Yeah,
good question.
I think you could make that argument when in the run up to it, all the talk was about the need to raise taxation revenue to meet the fiscal rules. And when you think about how small the net tightening, which has been announced, is, actually, taxes have been put up. You could argue mainly for the purpose of financing spending, which the government wanted to undertake. Now, you think about the reasons for that. Part of the reasoning, perhaps, is to pacify Labour MPs who feel that the government has been acting in a somewhat non-Labour way. There's no doubt that there are things here which go down very well with backbench Labour MPs. Not exclusively with that group, but playing to Labour MPs may have been part of it, I guess you could argue. The kind of wider sort of political context of showing the electorate perhaps a willingness to tax the more wealthy in society, with the mansion tax, and ideas that you're redistributing the tax revenue you're raising and making for a fairer society. There's potentially a bit of politics behind that as well.
Mm. I mean, one of the final comments that's come in, sort of question stroke comments, wouldn't an income tax increase have been very politically damaging, with Labour's current popularity falling, and competition from some of the other parties increasing? And I think the answer to that, again, is almost certainly yes. And coming back to a point we made at the start, perhaps that is a key reason why so many of these policies were leaked, to really almost take the temperature and see what was going to be particularly unpopular. I think it's really interesting too. I'm not the world's expert on politics. That's not what I teach. But I think this has been a perfect illustration that just because a government has a large majority in Parliament, that does not mean they're going to be home and dry in terms of what it is they want to do. And I think the last months or year or so have been perfect evidence of that, actually, where the Chancellor has really had a very tough balancing act that she's had to strike.
Yeah, on the whole, I'd like to see governments be a little bit braver sometimes with things which would be politically controversial. I think that governments today are almost dictated to by the political cycle and needing to get re-elected. But what might be achieved with leadership? If you can say to people, look, we know, but it's not popular to raise income tax, but we're gonna do it. It's necessary for this reason, that reason, and because we can use the revenue for that. I think we need to stop selling to the electorate the idea that you can have government spending without the taxation to pay for it.
Yeah.
People, if you give people the choice in isolation, would you like more government spending? They'll always say yes. If you ask them, would you like more taxes? They'll always say no. But somewhere the circle's got to be squared, and maybe with a little bit of leadership, a different.
I'm just so mindful of time, but there's one question I've spotted on the chat that's going to be the last one I pick out. And really, apologies if you've asked an excellent question that I've not come to, but hopefully I've got most of them. Would there have been a better way to use the 3 billion that's been spent on the lifting the 2-child limit? Would there have been a better way to spend that money to help child poverty? So, for example, childcare, education, school meals, etc. That's a really good question, I think.
It's a very good question. That is a very good question. I'm glad that the question is referencing using it in a better way to reduce child poverty. Because I think that's an important context for it. In terms of, go on, Cathy.
I was just going to say, my view is actually no. I think child poverty is such an immediate and pressing concern in the UK, and I think you have to do something right here, right now, to get more money to those families. I don't think it's the long-term answer. I think this is all linked with other inequalities, so educational inequality, for instance, different house prices, etc., etc., etc. But I think right here, right now, I think it was the only thing you could do to make a really big and immediate difference.
I'm going to endorse that answer. The other things we might spend that money on, put it into education. Of course, that's going to be valuable. If you can find ways of enhancing the educational opportunities of children who are currently being brought up in poverty, that's great. But the payoff to that in terms of reducing poverty is a longer term payoff. And Kath is absolutely right. This is a problem which is here now, which is damaging children in the current moment. And so, much better to do something which acts quickly.
Peter, just absolutely last thing. There is another one's just come in that I think will be a really good thing for people to go away and think about. Could there be an argument to increase the time for a government to be in office so they can enforce long-term plans for growth and stability without the fear of re-elections? I don't suggest we talk about that now, but I think that's a fabulous question.
I kind of want to, but it is a great question. I think we probably shouldn't now, because we're going to be straining people's patience.
Yeah, maybe they can contact you and give you some of their thoughts. But that would be a fantastic one for any teachers watching to discuss in class. And if teachers are not watching, their students can go back and suggest that question. I think I'm certainly going to be doing that with my students.
Brilliant. Massive thanks to you, Cathy, for your contributions to the session. You've been brilliant with the question and answers. Massive thanks to everyone who's come along as well. I hope it's been enjoyable. I hope it's been really useful to you. Do keep in touch, and thank you. Thanks ever so much for being here.
Yes, thank you, everyone. So pleased you asked me, and just fantastic questions coming in from everybody. It just shows what a high caliber of students we have at the moment.
We have indeed. Thanks then, everyone. Cheers, Anne.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.